Hello,
All
welcome
right.
to Superpower Broadcast. Yeah, tonight's debate night. We got Uncle Thomas here. Thanks for coming on, Uncle Thomas. We debated in the past a few months
Yes,
ago.
yes,
You did,
of
yeah,
course.
you did mention it back then that you wanted to debate Zionism at some point too, because if I recall correctly, we mostly were debating China the last time, right?
Yes, yes, we were, and then we kind of got in the weeds about some stuff, and we tried to veer off it because I think that, like I say, a lot of things are connected and kind of goes, off the rails sometimes. So we decided, or at least I decided that, eventually Israel had to be at least talked about and mentioned in some way. So I decided to focus on Zionism since you called yourself a Zionist. So I was like, okay, well, let's see what we can talk about with this. So.
Oh, for sure. For sure. And one thing that I remember that really kind of stood out to me that I was a bit surprised about is like I'll do debates and like half of them I find often turn into some variation of blood sports. And yet, despite us disagreeing on basically everything, we actually had a pretty polite conversation for our debate. Like I've had very heated debates with
Yeah.
Hawks in the last week in contrast, you know?
hmm Well,
Yeah.
like I said, I mean, part of it comes from me being older. I think that any aggression that I have is just usually put out in like separate videos where I just speaking into a mic and just get it out, and then just
Yeah.
it's done with. You know,
No, I gotcha. I
but yeah,
gotcha. But we
that
got
would be
more.
the way I said. But
Yeah, we got more subs here at this channel and everything right now. So if you wouldn't mind just kind of introducing yourself to my audience and letting them know a bit about you and where you stand, that'd be great because
oh yeah,
some people didn't see that debate, right? So
yeah, of course. So I'm called Uncle Thomas. It's just easier, it's just kind of the Thomas Magnum Avi. I would say in general that I guess I'll say gospel. I think in general I'd call myself more of a socialist in some way. I would say that I have a mix of left wing and right wing views on my channel, and we usually I talk about politics mostly. Get into a little bit of obviously speaking more about current day subjects. Talk a little bit about the history of things, and basically just kind of go off of that. Really, I think that pretty well explains it. And
gotcha,
occasionally I do
gotcha.
some memes. I'll put it that way too. I upload some movies. Yeah, yeah.
Memes, memes.
Yeah.
I didn't hear you. Oh, okay,
Yeah,
yeah, same here.
occasionally.
Like
Yeah.
I
Oh
run a
yeah,
meme
memes.
page, right? So like I love memes, dude. So
Mhm.
yeah. So let's get into it. So you're
Right.
the challenger. You get a few minutes
Sure.
to kind of make your opening remarks and then I'll give my position and then we can get into the debate.
Okay. Sure. Well, I would start with this: is that we are both Gentiles and everything else like that, so we can't really give a complete uh, talk about how Judaism is seen or how it is practiced, particularly in Israel, as we'll try to focus on. But I think that Zionism has a lot of meanings, and there's the traditional form of Zionism, which is more of the religious view, which is until the Messiah returns, then the descendants of the 144,000, I'm just going to say Hebraic people. That's just something that I like to say, just so I don't say Jew, because that you can, there's a lot of connotations just with using that word. So returning to Israel and then waiting for the Messiah to return, and then things will be better. This is kind of the view of groups like Nature Carta, who I will be mentioning a little bit here and there. So it's just kind of an alternate version of what Israel is now, which is arguably revisionist Zionism, which is comes from people like Theodore Herzl. It originated before that as well, but I think that I acknowledge the Holocaust did occur, the Shoah occurred, yes. And there was the Aliyah Bet, which was I believe wasn't officially recognized as a official Aliyah. I think in some cases, because there were 3 Aliyahs before that. But anyhow, I'm getting stuck in the weeds here. But basically, you had that occur, and but even before that, you had groups like Haganah, which I will mention as well. in this debate, which didn't have the best optics at times. I'll put it that way. For the most part, I'm sure the people will say overall they weren't violent, this and that, but there was definitely a push. There were tactics and methods that were used that, like I say, warfare is what it is. Ultimately, I think we can both agree on that. But I think that just the outrightness of it kind of just doesn't sit right with a lot of people. Also, I would say, of course, I think that it's kind of auspicious that we're talking about this, because now, of course, there is the move for a coalition government in Israel, which hasn't been included, is an Arab-Israeli party. Now, of course, they're probably not going to have that much influence. Overall, people are going to be talking about Naftali Bennett, who, in my opinion, I'm sure that we'll get into this as well, is pretty much a carbon copy in some ways. There are differences between him and Netanyahu, but we can quibble over that. Like I said, I think that we can knock this out maybe an hour and a half or 2 hours, and we'll go with that. But yeah.
I usually try to keep these things under
I think that's all
90 minutes roughly. So but yeah, no, you did mention, I mean, as far as the meanings of Zionism, there are a couple different terms. I mean, you mentioned the messianic meaning of it. What I think of with Zionism is more of what Herzl was getting at, is primarily a secular notion of a state for Jewish people to be secure from pogroms, persecution, etc., in their own land, essentially. That it exists independent of religiosity to some extent, because Jewishness is also, as the ethnic connotations and everything as well. And so a lot of early Zionists were, in that sense, secular too. And I mean, I'm a pretty secular person, though. In recent days, especially considering, some of the fissures that have erupted in my own community, I've been leaning more into the anti-theist camp recently, but I still would identify as secular, though. So in that sense, I would reject the messianic idea that you can't have a state until there's a return of a Messiah. It's like there is no Messiah. So.
Okay. Well, all right. I mean, we're not going to get into that anti-theist versus theist debate. That's a big thing that we don't need to get into. So let me continue with this here. So we're not going to go over the whole history of Israel, don't worry. But I will say is that I want to start with talking about a group called Haganah. And Haganah was started by a gentleman by the name of Ze'ev or Jacob Jabotinsky, who also started another group in Europe called Betar, which is more of a far-right group, which has some connections with Meir Kahane, which I will mention as well somewhere in there. But so what occurred is that Haganah was started in 1921, I believe. The thing is that, this is, we're seeing the beginnings of what is Zionism today in, probably even further back. Like I say, I've been reading a little bit of Herzl here before we started this. But
yeah,
the thing is that the movement of Zionism, as opposed to the religious, Jews who went to yeshiva, this and that, pretty much, saw things differently. And like I say, this is something, like I said, we're going to try not to get into the anti-theist versus theist debate, but I'll try to just mention it and then we'll continue. But what occurs is you have a lot of militancy rising up. And like I say, there's militancy as well amongst Arabs as well. Once, obviously the Ottoman Empire has fallen, the British take over. What occurs, is a lot of different events, which, like I say, we'll, just in the favor of time, stuff happen. And amongst these things, you mentioned, of course, that you're more of, secular and you support gay rights. I just saw your recent video. The thing is that there is a gentleman, I'm just going to start off at this point here, because I would argue that Zionists even, who are more secular and maybe even atheistic or anti-theistic in some ways, they let in a gentleman by the name of Jacob de Haan. And Jacob de Haan was from the Netherlands, who came to Israel and was a dedicated Zionist. But once he came to Israel, he became a little bit more lenient on Arabs. Because of this, he was executed by a gentleman by the name of Avraham Tahomi. And so, like I said, part of this, and of course, they give a lot of assumptions here as well. If you really dig into what hardcore Zionists believe, is that he was also a homosexual. So, like I say, there's this idea that, oh, well, Zionism today, obviously, we support LGBT rights. And it's very true about modern Israel. But I think this is more lip service than anything else, in my opinion. We've seen the gay pride parades.
That's where we're off
this and that. But yeah.
Yeah, that's where we'll kind of have to get into it, because you could look at the United States. Were gays treated well back in the day in America? No. Is America the safeguard of liberal values? Yes. So things change over time, right? And you can recognize that, basically all societies harbored homophobic tendencies for the longest sort of period of human history. That only recently are we sort of shaking off that yoke. And so I don't like this sort of almost conspiratorial idea that Israel, and it's a notion that I've seen referred to as homo nationalism, which is kind of goofy. This idea that Israel only gives the aesthetics or the facade of gay rights, but in reality, they just do that to make the West like them or whatever. I don't buy that, because they have their own social progression just as we do. And in my view, it kind of it situates Jewish and Israeli agency to be limited such that everything is a result of the conflict with their neighbors. And yet Israel exists as an independent nation, sovereign nation, with its own people, its own life, its own values, etc., independent of any sort of conflict that is thrust upon it. And so I would reject that idea that it's just lip service to the West. I think that there is a genuine, and that's not to say all of Israel. There are very conservative elements in Israel. There are more liberal elements in Israel. There are Muslims in Israel. It varies, right? It's just that in general, Israel is a pretty diverse country in that sense. And to the extent that there are people there that are pro-LGBT, the earnestness with which they espouse that is no different than those that live in California that espouse LGBT rights, for example. So they just happen to live in an area that's constantly under attack.
All right.
So.
Okay. Well, that was just I was just saying that as an example. So we have this time. This was about, I want to say, the late 1920s, early 1930s that this occurred. We have another group. I'm trying to set things up here. That way I can set an overview, and then I can talk about these groups individually a little bit. So Haganah, at least in my research here, has been more of an umbrella group. Now you had other groups such as AlAqsa. Now AlAqsa was the professionally trained military force, and they were actually planning to send AlAqsa into the North African campaign to help the British. This never occurred, but AlAqsa was kind of the nucleus of what became the IDF later on. AlAqsa were generally well-trained folks in general. And this will come up when I talk about Deir Yasin. Like I say, there are hundreds of thousands of events, but that we could even trace back further. But I'm going to try to remain in the 20th century, and I'm just going to hit bullet points so that we don't spend a ton of time. So you have that group as well. Now you had other groups such as the Stern Gang as well. Now Stern Gang was a legitimate fascist group. Avraham Stern was killed in his apartment, I believe, in 1940. So what I would say is that you have a cavalcade of other groups. Now with the Stern Gang, you had another group called Irgun. Now Irgun were not well trained in general. They were considered, I would say, that they were unprofessional, undisciplined. Now, I want to make sure here that I'm not promoting promoting any sort of anti-Semitism. This and that. I'm saying in terms of the group, what they were was they were extremists who believed in Zionism, but they weren't well trained, and they really didn't. They when they came up against Arabs at Deir Yassin, they fled along with the Stern Gang, or Lehi, as that group is called. So this is another group that I will be referring to as well in this argument a little bit. But I think that it's important to kind of set these things out and kind of set out what Zionism is, of course. And then you also have other groups as well. Like I say, I acknowledge that the Holocaust did occur. Once the Holocaust did occur, you had a massive amount of Hebraic people who went to Israel in the through this Aliyah bet, which is not officially, I believe, I'm not sure what bet means in Hebrew.
It's like
once this occurred,
it's unofficial immigration, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And from 1936, I believe, to 1948. But basically, once this occurred, you had a huge influx. You had the British as well. So I guess we'll get into, I'm going to go ahead and skip past that and get to the Second World War and talk a little bit more about Irgun. So Irgun at this time was led by a gentleman by the name of Menachem Begin, the future prime minister of Israel, who had a lifelong hatred of the British. You can feel as you want to about the British. I mean, a lot of folks in my community probably wouldn't care for the Brits in general. You can feel as you want to about them, but the British continued to hold on to, as it was known at the time, mandatory Palestine. And there were a lot of riots. You can talk about the White Paper, you can talk about the Balfour Declaration, but I believe that a lot of this was just kind of lip service in general, and they still had to fight for it. So I think the event that I want to talk about first is going to be the King David Hotel bombing. And what occurred here is that the British were, their headquarters was located at the King David Hotel. What Irgun decided to do is to get 7 milk churns filled with explosives. They set these up on different floors, some of which, now I can't necessarily verify all this, but some of the Irgun members were dressed as Arabs to purposely make it seem like the Arabs did this bombing. Now, this is, like I say, now what I get this from is from a documentary. I could link the video. We're going to save some time. But basically what occurred is that they dressed up as Arabs and placed these milk churns filled with explosives. Now, what occurred after this is that some say it was 5 minutes before, some say it was 5 minutes after, some say it was 15 minutes before. They called the French embassy, I believe it was the French embassy, and said, yes, there is a bomb. It will go off. This is, like I say, there's a lot of stuff lost to history, but the bomb did go off, or the bombs, plural, did go off, killing 92 people. Officially, it was 91, but 92. The 92nd one was a member of Irgun. And so what occurred is, of course, is that, many people said this is one of the largest terrorist attacks. And you will, like I said, there's footage that says, basically said, yeah, we did what we had to do, this and that. It was needed because we had to liberate our country. That's how people feel about it. Now, to me, this is kind of like, very iffy to say the least. Now, of course, the King David Hotel still exists.
Okay,
and the reason I mention this,
you gotta. You mentioned the mandatory Palestine. The British weren't exactly like the most democratic and enlightened in terms of their governance of Palestine, right? Like, I'm not saying it was like hell on earth or anything, but you get arrested there just for trying to uphold your own national aspirations, right? That's actually what happened to some of the guys that prompted that attack. I'm not defending the attack. I don't defend targeting like civilians, but look,
right.
If you're being denied your own sovereignty, basically, you do have you do have self-defense, right, in that sense. So, I mean, if I was there under the
What was
yoke of
Chaim
Britain, I'd
Weizmann
probably.
doing? Okay, Chaim Weizmann. Okay. So Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, was making deals, this and that. He was in the UK, and of course, Chaim Weizmann famously said that basically, when London was a swamp, Jerusalem was this thriving city. Very, very chauvinistic, to say the least, in my opinion. Anyway, this is very, very arrogant. You can say that if you will, but the thing is, you would see them as allies. Now, the reason you can say, oh, okay, well, the British weren't the most democratic in self-defense. The thing is, though, is that in 2006, there was a plaque put on the King David Hotel where it said basically is that, we called 5 minutes beforehand, this and that. And, basically the British were still up in arms. This was a huge affair, that occurred even at the time. And of course, back in 2006, this is something that, urban fighters were still there. And it goes to show that, they still see it as a founding, event to defend the idea of Zionism. There were prison breaks that occurred under Erdogan.
Yeah, but the
as well.
the American Revolution was not bloodless. Like, you'd have to admit that the patriots in America did some shady things against the British when they were occupying the colonies, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing that happens in warfare, and I don't know the specific details around the King David Hotel, but I got a guy in the chat saying that that it was basically at the time being used as a military command center. And so if that's, and I'll look into that right now, but if that's the case, by all means, military targets are on the table. You can bomb those, right? So that's how war works. I don't condone civilian targeting, but by all means, British military targets are on the table, right? Like, you would admit that in war, military targets are fair game, right?
Okay. Well,
I
have other
is there a
events as well
problem
that
with
we can talk about.
targeting
Okay.
military command posts, right? I mean, because that's the thing. It's kind of the same as what they're doing right now, where they'll target, like the IDF will target Hamas installations that happen to be based in civilian areas. They'll give them a warning ahead of time, yet they're still targeting what would officially be a civilian building. It just happens to have a military component inside of it, such as the recent Al Jala Tower, which was playing host to Hamas military intelligence analysis, as well as the offices of the Associated Press and Al Jazeera. Israel, in that case, gave people an hour, including Hamas, an hour to get out, but they still targeted the building nonetheless. Now, you could call that terrorism. Oh, you're bombing a civilian building, but it's war. Things like, and not everything that happens in war is pretty, right, Uncle Thomas? So, what's your main contention with the bombing?
Well, the King David Hotel, to me, like I say, dressed as Arabs. Do you think that's okay? Do you think? I mean, like I say, would you compare this to, for example, the dumping of the tea? Would you compare that the dumping of the tea by dressing up as British? British redcoats. I mean,
it goes back to what Sun Tzu. No, it goes back to that old line. It goes back to that old line by Sun Tzu that all war is based on deception, right? The Israelis just last month said we are under direct invasion of Gaza. We are invading them. That's what the IDF tweeted out. Now, it wasn't true, and Vosh was mad that he was lied to, but it was great because it sent all the Hamas guys into their terror tunnels, where the IDF was able to pummel them from above. They basically they baited them, right? I mean, that's how war works. You're never going to say to the enemy, "We are of this side. We are about to do this to you." Except, looking at it, yeah, it does appear that they did give them a warning. So there was even that to some extent. So I guess the problem that I have is, like, in this particular case, Israel versus Britain, I support Israel. So.
Okay. That's because I will bring this up again. You know what I will say ultimately is this was a very cowardice attitude. And there are other other factors that will occur. Like I said, this is no different than the Germans dressing up as Polish soldiers to take over a German radio station to make it seem as though the Polish were invading. Would you say that that was
Wait,
acceptable in terms of the Germans, for example?
what do you think? Like, just clearly, I got to ask you though, what's your view of Hamas using civilian centers as bases of military operations? Do you support it, or do you think that they should have established military bases that are independent of civilian areas?
I would say they would do what they have to do. Ultimately, yeah, I
So
would
would
like
I.
to
That's
say,
why I would say that about the
they should
Jews. The
have
Jews got to do.
military
The Jews
installations.
got to do. The Jews got to do what the Jews got to do. So that's what I would say. Like if I'm back there and I'm under mandatory Palestine, and I want to be free from persecution and everything else, and I want a land of my own, and I want to be safe in my own land, I might have joined the Irgun, for example. I might have joined Haganah. You know, if I was in Israel today, I'd join the IDF, for example. So.
Okay. So I have another affair. This occurred pretty much just right after the King David Hotel bombing, which was the Sergeant's affair. Now, I'm sure there's something a little bit different here with this. So three Irgun fighters were captured by the British. And what occurred then was that the Irgun captured 2 British sergeants. Now, what occurs after this? Well, by trial. Now, you can say what you will about how legitimate it was. By trial, they were sentenced to hang. So they were overjoyed by this because they felt that they were sacrificing their life for Zionism. So these 3 Irgun fighters are hung. In response, the 2 British sergeants that the Irgun has are hung. They don't want to do the same type of thing. What they do is that they are moving these 2 British sergeants who are from the military intelligence sector around. They hang them in a building. They held in a living room or something like that. They hang them. So they're already dead. They take them to a eucalyptus grove. So both bodies are there. They place booby traps on these bodies. And, this is obviously continuing the violence that occurs. The thing is that, once this happens, then we see that, it really tests the British will and everything else like that. I mean, this is a very, like I said, this is very much like the Viet Cong, wouldn't you say? But yeah, continue. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, it really does come back to a fundamental question, I would say, which is, do the Jewish people have a right to have their own land and be secure in their own land?
Why couldn't they share the land with the Palestinians that they had done for hundreds of years?
You had
Why couldn't they do that?
basically,
Even under the Ottoman Empire, they were.
what I don't understand here, right, is that land had ancestral significance to Jews, and to some extent you can say that as well to the rest of the population that lived there. Here's the problem, though. Jews had no nation of their own. This kind of goes back to the whole thing about Herzl and whatnot, which is that you basically need to have, and then kind of the idea was, a land without a people for a people without a land. And yeah, there were people in British Palestine and whatnot. It's just that the thing is, that's a pretty good place to put the Jewish state, though, given the historical significance and everything else, and of course the long-standing inhabitation by Jewish people there. You also had a big influx of people that were Jews that lived outside of what was then mandatory Palestine. And where were they going to have a state?
Mm-hmm.
Were they going to make Germany their state? No, they a lot of them wanted to go to what we know now as Israel, right? And so the Arabs, in contrast, they had a huge swath of territory, and I mean, they invaded Israel. They've gained up on Israel a number of times. What I don't understand is, like, it's a very small amount of area. It seems like not that big of an ask to say, well, that's where the Jews get to be secure, right? I mean, thousands of years of persecution, and yet we can't even make one small 40,000 square kilometer area for them. It seems unreasonable to me, and so there had to be a state somewhere, and I can't think of a better place than where we know is Israel, right? So,
okay, so let me ask you this question: who gave this land to Israel? Was it given by God? I know that like I said, we're touching on anti-theism versus theism here, but let's just make sure.
Yeah, well, you can look at that
Was
from
the land
a
given
number.
to Israel?
Well, it goes to the Israelites that inhabited that area were Jewish, right? And in Jewish theology, that land was given to them by God. I don't want to talk about whether or not that's true here because I don't think it's relevant, because the Israelites that inhabited that land up to basically the Jews that inhabited it up to 1948 were basically all part of an ethnic trajectory that had at its sort of historical underpinnings that basis for it. And so it was a distinctive ethnic group. And we could say, well, look at India. We could look at, a number of different areas in the world where there's an ethnicity that's inhabited a land, and at the basis of that beginning, they have at their sort of creation myth the idea that God gave them that land. Another great example of this would be a lot of Native American bands, Native North American bands. They had, for example, in Canada, some of them had the creation myth that the creator of the universe, Raven, bestowed upon them that land. But regardless of whether or not Raven created the universe, the fact of the matter is that you can draw back a lineage of people of that ethnicity that had a historical claim to that land. Now, in Israel, it's a little more complicated. Were they necessarily the first? No, there were lots of wars that happened back then. But the point is that the Israelites were victorious, and they managed to establish some degree of hegemony over a swath of territory, and that for thousands of years, ethnic Jews have had a legitimate claim to that territory. So you talk about land sharing. The problem is we can have land sharing where they get Jordan and the Jews get Israel, for example. Like what we have right now is land sharing. You have separate countries, right? It's not necessarily practical at the moment to have it all be one country, though I debated Spooky Nookies on this, arguing that down the road, we'd like to see the integration of Israel, because I just don't regard Palestine as a valid state, but that would take a long time, a long project. And of course, eventually, tens of thousands of years down the road, the sort of project would be that we'd have a sort of a post-religious society and more of a humanist society. No, I'm not sure that could ever actually happen. And I've talked about how I think that there's a chance that religion might always be with us, but eventually, at a bare minimum, everything should have a secular basis to it. But that may take thousands of years to get to. So that's my sort of explanation there. I think, yeah, you absolutely, regardless of what your religion is, it's obvious that Jews have been inhabiting that land for a long ass time. So.
Okay.
People did live there before Jews, but Jews won.
Stuff. I'm not going. Okay. So let's talk about it from this angle then. So Crimea was controlled by the Russian Tsar, and of course, large parts of Ukraine, for example, voted to stay within the Soviet Union. Wouldn't that be considered Russian land in some way?
Voted to stay within the Soviet
Russian. They practice.
Yeah, but the Soviet Union was falling apart. That wasn't really a thing. Are you referring to the Russian Federation?
Yeah, I'm referring to. Well, I could talk about the Tsars. You could talk about the cultural similarities between Ukrainian versus Russian. There are a lot of connections there. Like I said, this is much the same way as with Ashkenazi Jews versus, let's say, Mizrahi Jews or Sephardic Jews. They, like I say, you can say that they are one people, but there's a lot of differences between them, between their beliefs, which I'll probably bring up a little bit more with Meyer Kahana. But yeah, would you say that, for example, like I say, since they have a shared cultural history, this just sounds like we're going to defend revanchism in some ways, but in other ways, it's not okay. It feels like cherry picking to me, but go ahead and continue. Go ahead.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say it's there's any sort of double standard. Like I've always said, I'm for American interests, I'm anti-Russian interests, I'm for Israeli interests, I'm anti Hamas. Like I'm on a side, right? Like I support the West, I support Western partners, and so for me, my interest is in having the West win. And so you mentioned Crimea, for example. De facto, right now, Russia took it, and I blame Obama for that because he was weak and let it happen. And you know what? I've said before, that's a win for Putin. And I hate Obama. I regard Obama as a pathetically weak president, but that's on him. I'm not going to blame Putin for being smart enough to see that Obama was a weak isolationist and take advantage of that. This is why I want war hawks in charge, so that our enemies don't fuck around, because nobody was deterred by Obama. Assad wasn't deterred by Obama. Putin wasn't deterred by Obama. This is what I talk about peace through strength, that if your enemy feels you're weak, you're guaranteeing conflict to occur because you've generated a power vacuum. And so for me, in that case of Crimea, for example, you can say, well, are there a lot of people in eastern Ukraine that align with Russia? Yes, that is technically true. I've studied Ukraine. Here's the thing, though, is that it misses a couple of points. The first point is that Russians have a long history of persecuting Ukrainians and forced Russifying them, especially in the eastern part of the country. And second, in modern times, the Party of Regions, which was Yanukovych's party, and their media apparatus basically meant that people that lived in that part of the country only were really able to watch Yanukovych's gang's party, their media, as well as Russian media. And they were basically inculcated into aligning with Russia, even though Russia and the Kremlin don't really like them. They don't regard Ukrainians as equals. They regard Ukrainians as little Russians, as lesser, as things to be subjugated. And so it's kind of like saying, well, the North Korean people, if there was an election right now, even if it was like relatively fair, Kim Jong-un might win, but that doesn't mean that it's actually a fair election, because it would be ignoring the decades of brainwashing where people don't know anything differently. It's not that same extent in Ukraine, but for a lot of those people, especially older people in the area, they had no exposure to the West. They knew nothing other than the heel of the Russians, and that's Stockholm syndrome, right? You grow to love your captor, and that's a big problem. And above all of that, and that's just the historical aspect of it, just on the Cold War aspect of it, I side with Kiev over Moscow. So of course I'm going to support Crimea as Ukrainian territory. But again, historically speaking, the degree to which it was Russian as a result of imperialism, right? So.
Okay. Well, I'll try to stick on point with Israel then, I guess. So obviously, there is the AlAqsa Mosque. Let's go ahead and dig into this a little bit. What do you think that the AlAqsa Mosque should be destroyed, or what should happen to it?
Yeah, so on that, see, that's a complicated one, because the AlAqsa Mosque really, or the Temple Mount, both of those have really theological connotations to them. I mean, from a really sort of objective perspective, you can look at that and say, well, this is matter arranged in such a manner that it has properties that compose a building, right? That there's nothing special about that. But to a lot of religious people, it has a long significance. And Muslims regard it as basically, that their prophet Muhammad was taken there in the night, and in a heavenly prophecy, and that's where he talked to God and everything. And of course, to religious Jews, that would be the Temple Mount. What happens to that, realistically speaking, from a fully secular perspective, it depends on who's administering it. There are a lot of people in Israel that would definitely like to see the AlAqsa Mosque basically, done away with. But I think a fair compromise there would be that you have equal right to worship there for Muslims and Jews. But at the end of the day, I think the bigger solution to all of this, like way down the road, is just a decrease in religiosity across the board until eventually it's just handled as any other building would, and just made into a historical site, that sort of thing. I think that a lot of this sort of attributing, divinity or these sorts of aspects or characteristics to just random aggregations of matter on the surface of the planet it's kind of anachronistic. It's kind of old school, So that's my view. What do you think should happen with the AlAqsa Mosque?
Well, I personally think the AlAqsa Mosque should continue. It is the third most, the highest, I believe it's the third most highly respected, and maybe I'm using the wrong words here, within Islam.
Sacred.
And so I do feel at the end of the day, like I say, yeah, sacred. Yeah, that's where I meant. But I would say that it's a very complicated affair. We saw I really don't want to jump into what occurred, for the 11-day. You may disagree with what I may say here, but the 11-day scuffle that occurred between Israel and the various Arab nations, like I say, it's a very complicated thing, and a lot of things are occurring. And of course, this has led to now the coalition party that has now pretty much almost taken control in Israel, and we'll see how that shakes out. Like I say, I'm not going to make any assumptions. I would assume that you won't as well, but I think that it's a very complicated affair, and I think that there will be a lot of changes, or there may not be that many changes at all, at least at first, of what occurs in Israel. I think it's important to talk about where Zionism is going.
So Uncle Thomas, are you religious then?
Yeah.
Okay. And
I
which
would
religion
say that
do you
I
know?
am. Yes. I would say that now officially I haven't. I guess I would say that I was baptized in baptism, but I am leaning more towards, I think, Catholicism, because it is the original form of Christianity. Like I say, that's my opinion, though. I think overall I hold more of a secular view of religion in general. But yeah, that's how I feel about it in general. I believe that,
Yeah,
I think that religion is a very complex thing, but yeah, we have to make it work somehow.
I find that kind of interesting, because for me, like I've said before, if I were ever to become Christian, I would be a Calvinist. I find Catholicism being, well, Jesus founded the Catholic Church. That's technically true, but if Jesus were to look on what the Catholic Church has become over the last 2,000 years, from the standpoint of Scripture alone, he would regard it as degenerated. I mean, it basically became a political powerhouse of popes living, many of them, incredibly sinful lifestyles, keeping a continent under heel, where even the kings were subjugated to them. I think that Catholicism in general today, to me, it seems like it's so intertwined in ritualism and everything that for me, I find it interesting that Catholicism still has a sway. Like I said, like if I were to convert to Christianity, I think that Calvinism and Protestantism make a lot more sense to me. But what what really kind of sold you on Catholicism, though, just from your perspective?
I would say, I would say, just it being the original church, it has its problems. I would say in general that it just, I think it came down more to the, like you say, the rituals. I think that there are plenty of, like I said, once again, there are plenty of problems with the Catholic Church, but I would say that it has the most original views. And obviously, the Catholic Church is a vastly complicated organization, I guess you could say, whichever the case may be. But that's what I would say. Ultimately, the rituals and the connection to a larger history. And I think you can't really get into history to a point without, especially European history, without talking about the Catholic Church in some way or form, at least in my opinion.
Well, yeah,
So I think
would just
it's
say
necessary to at least understand that. Yeah.
yeah, I would just say that the history of Europe that the Catholic Church went on to form demonstrated in many ways a deviation from Scripture, in my view. But I would say, though, that in general, when it comes down to a lot of this stuff, I think one thing about the Catholic Church in terms of their teachings that I think it's pretty controversial is the infallibility of the Pope. Do you regard the Pope as infallible, or it basically is like an almost living prophet in that sense? Or what's your view of the role of the Pope today?
I think it's complicated, to be honest with you. Like I say, I haven't been officially baptized into the Catholic Church, so I can't really say that much. But I would say that I hold some loose values of it. I would say more of a, yeah. That's my opinion. Yeah.
What do you think of Francis?
It's a very complex thing, but I feel. I think that he has, he's done some very iffy things in general, but he is still, the head of the church. I feel that, in terms of working with Evo Morales, maybe some good points there, but then also with some other aspects, I feel like there's a little bit back and forth. But yeah.
Well, Evo Morales, he's like, I mean, a lot of people would call him a communist. I would call him more of like objectively a socialist. I mean, I guess you're an asshole, so that's not like an insult or anything. I guess from your side, but I'm not a fan of Morales.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of Morales.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, we can move on though. I know we were going to debate about Zionism, so you can continue with your points about Zionism. So.
Right. So I think I'll say this as another point, because I did say I was going to mention it, just to make sure. So just to kind of elate that, you said that, and I know that, you just said this in the manner of the debate and everything else like that. You would, like I said, life is a complicated thing, but you said that you would be part of Irgun or, possibly some group like that. What occurred in 1947 was, right. That's what I'm saying. That's why I'm trying to be good faith and trying not to say, oh, well, put you in that place. I'm trying to be good faith about that. But so the Deir Yasin massacre that occurred. Now, I'm sure this is I'm sure that there are, records that go back and forth, and I'm sure everything else. But what occurred, I think that, as we try to do in court, where it's like, this is the statement of events that most everyone agrees with, is that they planned to take over this village called Deir Yasin. And what occurred is that Irgun, along with the Lehi, or the Stern Gang, came in, and what basically happened is that the Arabic villagers that were there were used to folks coming in and trying to steal and rob. So because of that, they started to shoot back. And Irgun and Lehi promptly left because they weren't prepared for anyone to fight back. And so what occurred, I think in general, like I say, I'm sure that the people will dispute some of the facts and whatnot, but what occurred then is that Palmach, as I explained earlier, Palmach came in and they lobbed 3 mortar shells into the village. And what occurred after that is that they came in and they basically killed everybody. Men, women, children. So according to some things, like I say, you take it with a grain of salt. But what occurred is that some men were drugged through the streets and were paraded through the streets as trophies in some way. The dead were stripped of, like watches and things like this. And the village is now, of course, incorporated into a larger Israeli city today. And, in general, the other parts, such as the Arabic cemetery that is there, is fenced off and no pictures. It's one of these things. I think that in a lot of ways, this is kind of, I'm going to make a bad comparison, and I'm sure that you will probably point this out. To me, this is somewhat like a similar way to Uledua in France, where the entire town was destroyed and burned. Everyone was put into a barn because the French partisans, I'm trying to think, basically the French resistance killed a couple of members of the 2nd SS Das Reich Division. And because of that, they destroyed the whole village. And today is now, of course, an example of this is what, Nazism did. Deir Yassin, of course, is seen as a source of shame in some ways. And this is just an example of what occurred, I would say, at that time. But yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not going to say
someone else,
that
has any.
Yeah, I'm not going to say that the record of the early days of Israel was 100% clean. I mean, there was basically a series of wars that resulted in, and a lot of civilians were killed on both sides. The problem, I guess, what's at stake here, getting back to the whole thing about Zionism, is do Jewish people have a right to their own land? And I don't believe that a couple paramilitary groups doing what you could say is an atrocity disqualifies the Jewish people from being secure in their own land. You know what I'm saying? So,
okay,
like, because America has done things in the past that
right.
you could say weren't incredibly great. There have been massacres committed by the United States, and notably in recent history, we can look at what Blackwater's done. I'm against private military contractors. They tend to commit war crimes at a way higher rate than standing soldiers. And yet, are we going to say America therefore doesn't have a right to exist? Nobody would say that. But when it's the Jews, there's always this double standard. They're always exceptionally, anything that goes wrong immediately, they're always under this spotlight. And I find that oftentimes things that happen in Israel or that are conducted by Israeli forces that might have an equivalent elsewhere in the world will always rush to condemn Israel for even the slightest infraction from what we would see as perfect behavior. And yet the rest of the world oftentimes will get a pass by those same agents. And so I know you consider yourself a Nazbol. What's your view on North Korea's right to sovereignty? Do you view their human rights record as disqualifying their sovereignty?
No, I don't. I would say overall that it is the land, like I said, both North and South Korea are the land of the Korean people. This has been, debated. You can go back even furthermore than I would say arguably with Israel, because obviously they have been oppressed by the Japanese, by the Chinese to a certain degree, throughout the Koryo Empire and everything else. Like I say, I'm not as versed on Korean history, but I think that, yes, as opposed to Israel, like I said, what I would say is this, is that
the Koreans
simply cannot. I think that to a point.
Yeah, the Koreans were basically like a hermit kingdom, though. They did have their own autonomy for the longest of time. The Jews in modern, like the last couple thousand years, it hasn't really been a thing. There's the diaspora, which didn't happen with Korea. I don't regard them as analogous, but what I was more so getting at was just the atrocities. So we can pinpoint a couple specific cases. Like, look, there were agents in Israel that did a massacre in southern Lebanon too, and then that was blown out of proportion. But am I going to endorse that? Absolutely not. I don't endorse the purposeful killing of civilians. But here's the problem. Right? to me, it seems that you're operating on a double standard, where if a country that you're more ideologically aligned with does an atrocity, that doesn't disqualify them from their sovereignty. But if Israel has a history that isn't pristine, that is disqualifying from their sovereignty. So do you believe, I guess this is the crux of the debate here, do you believe that there should be a Jewish state in that part of the world, or do you think that Jews should just live within an Arab administered state, I guess?
I think it could be shared, to be honest with you. I do think they can be shared, because obviously, even in this recent coalition, the coalition party does have a minority Jewish, or excuse me, Israeli Arab party that does exist in this coalition. So it does exist. Are you going to say that that the coalition party should be disbanded because they have a party that represents 20% of their population?
Arabs, let's be clear about this. Arab Israelis can coexist within Israel, but Israeli Jews can't coexist within an Arab state like Gaza administered Palestine, because if you try being Jewish over there, good luck. They're actually the apartheid state. The problem is that Jews in Israel are beyond gracious and welcoming and diplomatic in their offering of resolution. A great example of this would be that after a hard-fought war that resulted in many Jews dying, they actually gave up half of their territory and gave over the Sinai back to those from which they had taken it in Egypt. That was something they didn't have to do, but they did. They've done various. This was all done in an effort to secure peace. No, but it was all done in an effort to secure peace. Now contrast this to the Arabs. What have the Arabs in Gaza done in contrast? They refuse to even acknowledge the Jews' right to existence in Israel, and have proceeded to, just in the last month, fire over 4,000 rockets, all of which constitute over 4,000 war crimes, because they were purposefully targeted at civilian population centers in Israel. And yet we're somehow supposed to expect that Jews can coexist with them. No. The Arabs can coexist within Israel, but Arabs aren't interested in Jews coexisting with them in Arab-controlled territories right now in that area. So there is a double standard, or there is a difference rather, which is that Jews are tolerating and Arabs in that part of the world haven't been, especially in Gaza. So.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about a couple issues here. There's the issue of how, for example, Ethiopian Jews are treated. There was the issue, and I think that you talked. No. It was Zarathustra's serpent, but he said, of course, about the making the women sterile as well. And this was a limited case, but this was a very bad issue. I would also bring up, of course, is that.
Yeah, I don't endorse
even
that.
Like I say, this goes to show how the Jewish community is not united. Well, yeah, but the thing is, though, is you say that
they're diverse.
They're not all the same people.
They're diverse.
They're not all the same people.
Contrast that to Gaza. In Gaza, you want to try to be Jewish or gay or anything, you're going to get thrown off a roof. So Israel is a diverse society. It's a pluralistic society.
Whoa. Can you cite me a source where one homosexual was thrown off a building in Gaza?
Wait, seriously?
I don't think that has ever occurred.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I'll go ahead and drop it in the private.
Yeah, so in Gaza, now I don't want to violate TOS with like grotesqueness or anything here, but to keep it short, gays are routinely dragged by motorcycles to death against the road. Additionally, one of the former leaders of Hamas, not just some random dude in Gaza, one of their former leaders was purged from Hamas under charges of being homosexual, and he was executed. Now, in that case, was he specifically thrown from a roof? I couldn't tell you. But the point was that he was murdered on the charge of being homosexual. In Israel, even if you're guilty of being homosexual, you're not going to be executed. There's a little bit of a difference. Now to the point about the Ethiopians and stuff, again, I'm not saying that Israel has a perfect track record, but I pointed out North Korea. North Korea forced sterilizes women. North Korea does forced abortions. North Korea does chemical weapons experiments on its own people and kills them in the concentration camps. And yet you said that those incidents didn't disqualify them from having sovereignty, yet Israel, in defending herself, forfeits sovereignty. I don't understand this. So look, I'm not like some big sovereignty bro. There are conditions under which you can lose your sovereignty. But what I'm surprised about is that people in your camp generally make an appeal to sovereignty with Assad. Why doesn't Israel have sovereignty? Is my question. Why don't they get to be sovereign?
Because what is it justified by? I mean, we've already.
It's justified by the same degree of ancestral claim as any other people group that, like Japanese, for example. What is Japan and the existence of the Japanese state justified by? Oh, that's right, the ancestral territory of the Japanese people and their continued lineage occupying that land or inhabiting that land, right? Is that to say that those were the only people that were ever there? No, you go back thousands, tens of thousands of years, there were different people groups, but the Japanese won. And in modern times, that's their land. That's how war works, right? So
it's just a matter. So it's might makes right.
But that's how the world works. Like the world is, but the world has always been anarchic, right? Like I would hope that this is something that, regardless of our politics, we could agree on, that there's no world government that just comes in if you do a no, right? Like the world, you're on your own in the world. We would agree, right? Like at a state level or a nation level.
So,
like, no. Do you agree to that, or do you think that, like, because by this logic, most countries wouldn't be legitimate because there was like the Circassians, for example. You could go back and say, well, that's their territory, but then before them there were different people groups. We could just all the way go back and say all the world and all the countries in the world, technically you could say most of them just belong to the first people groups that came out of Eastern Horn of Africa area. But here's the problem with that. Those specific cultures don't exist anymore. They all evolved and were conquered by other cultures. We deal with what we have today, and what we see today are the victors. That even in people groups like Jews or Kurds, who were for the longest time denied their statehood, and the Kurds still are, they're still victors over the people groups that existed before them. So we all stand on the shoulders of victors, and if we didn't, we would have been dead in the ground thousands of years ago, right? So that's kind of how the world works, because there has never been a true world police. Now, I want America to be the world police, but it's not officially institutionalized as that. The closest thing we have today is the UN, and the UN is a joke. I would hope you would agree with me that the UN is not like a serious force that just comes in.
But
so you got to look after your own people. I would
say in response is that the U.S. I mean that.
So why don't Jews get to look after? Why don't Jews get to look after Jews? I don't understand that. Why do Arabs have a right to any of that?
Because they don't.
Why can't they? What?
Well, okay. Let me answer your first question.
So let's just have it be a statement.
Jews look after Jews. You mean? Oh, let me finish my point. So let's talk about the Haredi people, for example. The Haredi, which are the Orthodox Jews, who for the most part are exempted from the IDF. There have been huge riots that have occurred. They say, we refuse to join the IDF. And even when they do join the IDF, they are put into their own separate little battalion, separate from everybody else. Do you think that they are being persecuted by fellow Jews, or do you think that it is, basically they need to toe the line?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's actually a good question. I would say I'd apply the same standard as I would in Canada or the United States here, and say that whatever term you want to call it, conscientious objection, etc. It amounts to sedition. Like we have to live in the real world, and in the real world. Now, by the way, I'm not a supporter of conscription, except in cases where it necessitates it. Unfortunately, it's not of their own choosing, but in Israel, they have to do conscription. In an ideal world, every country would have professional soldiers, and that would be that. Israel doesn't have that luxury. In Israel, it's a matter of national security. It's a matter of the existence of the state, which is paramount. I mean, because any sort of freedoms that you could give to different people would all be gone if Israel were to be wiped out. Those people would be killed and forced into the Mediterranean to die, just as all the other Jews, if the Palestinians had their way. So no, you don't get to basically get out a conscription free card if you're literally in Israel. It's not their fault, but no,
this is something that was promised to them in 1948. This is something that was promised to them by David Ben-Gurion. Do you think that that's wrong?
Yeah, but the material circumstances changed almost immediately. Israel has been ganged up on multiple times, and to this day, they face mortal enemies that seek not just to occupy them and enslave them, but to outright kill them and take their land. And this is something where Israel has a choice to make, and I understand that the IDF is very powerful, and the IDF is a very capable force of its own, but even still, the IDF has to do conscription. And in my view, I don't think it's necessarily fair. I just don't. And I believe that the national interest is paramount.
So let's break this down further, because you say, should the Jews, control the land? Let's ask a more basic question. It is
their land, right?
I'm being very Wignat here, but very white supremacist. But let's ask this though: are Jews a race or is it a religion? In your
it's
like I say, I know that we're stepping towards the anti-theist, but let's.
Yeah, it's an ethnicity and it's also a religion. But for all intents and purposes here, we can think of it as an ethnicity, because though the barbarians that would come and execute all the Jews, they're not going to ask if you're atheist or if you're Reform or if you're Orthodox. They're going to see if you're Jewish, and if you're Jewish, they're going to kill you and your family. So if in the material reality of what is taking place in that area, you can call it the Holy Land, you can call it whatever you want, that area of Israel and what is referred to as Palestine, that area, what matters is your ethnicity here. And so I'm talking in terms of ethnicity, because all those distinctions don't matter. And spoiler alert to anybody watching right now, if you are Jewish, but you're anti-Zionist, I got news. When they come to murder you, they're not going to give you brownie points. You're going to the same chambers as the other Jews would go. So be a Zionist. I'm not Jewish and I'm a Zionist. So Zionism or GTFO, that's my attitude.
Okay. Because the thing is, like I say, let's get into this then. So what do you think of the legacy of Rabbi Meir Kahane and his belief that all Arabs should be kicked out of Israel? They should have, like I say, all the conspiracy theories about the Greater Israel Project. He believed all of that. He also believed that you cannot have democracy and Zionism at the same time. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, okay, so there's a lot to dissect there. On the point about democracy and Zionism, that kind of goes back to what Reese and I were talking about, which is that I agree with Reese, which is that if you were to immediately just subsume Palestine right now into Israel, you couldn't have it work at the moment, because Jews would be outnumbered and you'd have the circumstances set up for another round of pogroms and persecution. So for me, I look at it and I say, we can't do it on a racial basis, because there are plenty of Arabs out there that are great, enlightened people, but that there are a lot of Arabs in that part of the world, specifically in Palestine, where they've been. Yeah, so what you do is what I advocate, which is military administration. So the IDF goes into the West Bank, goes into Gaza, eliminates Hamas, dismantles Fatah, and establishes military administration followed by perhaps decades, if not longer, of basically de-radicalization of the population and eventual incorporation into Israel with equal rights, where you could eventually down the road have Jews and Arabs living in harmony under a secular system in which their race is not the primary determinant of whether you're good or bad, right? That you're evaluated on your own character.
That sounds very similar to what people accuse the Chinese of doing in Xinjiang. That sounds so familiar. So, are you a base China man now? Are you a base
no,
Communist Party
I don't
of China?
support. I don't support.
That's
I
very
don't
surprising.
support. Yeah, I don't support concentration camps. I don't support forced sterilization, and I don't support communism. I don't support indoctrinating anybody into communism. And so, for me, and again, you could still be Muslim in this example. The difference is you have to get rid of the anti-Semitism somehow, and that's the de-radicalization process. The fact of the matter is that Gaza and Palestine existing as they are, refusing to acknowledge the West Bank, refusing to acknowledge Israel's right to existence. I mean, you have to secure your existence, and the best way to do that is to eliminate Hamas, for example. And so, to draw a comparison to what's happening
we must secure the existence of our people.
Yeah, no, that's the thing is to draw a comparison to
we must secure the existence of our people.
No, I don't think you get it. I'm not a fan of the CCP.
Oh, yeah.
I would literally, and I've said it before, I would side with the Mujahideen over the CCP. The CCP is a mortal enemy of America. They're an existential threat, and they have to be neutralized. And anybody that we can work with over there, I'll take it. I'll take it. I want to destroy the CCP. So guilty as charged. So.
Okay, I'm going to just point this out as a side note here, but I want to, this is just very, like I say, work with whoever. The thing is that, okay, I was watching this video on Bloomberg about talking about, I'm trying to think of it now, basically the chips. There was once 25 companies that made semiconductor chips. It is now down to 3. There's the Intel. That is basically they're going out because Intel, it's just the technology is getting too vast. The production, they have to make something like 1 trillion in a year, because I think it's like 250 for each one person, I believe, is how they produce these chips. And basically what occurs is that now it is between basically Taiwan and now China is getting theirs built in Shenzhen. The thing is that you would probably say base Taiwan, but the thing is though is that Taiwan allows their people to go to China, and they can get poached all the time. Do you think that those, like I say, so we see that, but this is the way this system has been set up. They have
the question?
Literally painted themselves in a corner.
Wait. What's the question exactly? I just want to understand specifically what you're asking me.
Well, no, I'm just pointing this out as just as the side note here, is that basically the tech companies painted themselves into a background here. But like I say, maybe that's just a side point, but I just wanted to say that. So, okay, let's get back on topic here. So Meir Kahane believed in these ideas, and like I say, maybe these are just straw man arguments. So you know what? I'll drop that up. All right. I'll give this to you.
Wait,
is it maybe I've provided a lot of straw man arguments?
But wait, Uncle Thomas, just on the point about democracy, do you believe that if Gaza were to be incorporated into Israel right now, and all those people, including Hamas members, were to be given rights to vote in Israeli elections, do you really think they wouldn't go about persecuting Jews to weasel their way into power to get an upper hand over Jews?
Well,
like, you have to admit that there's so much anti-Semitism in that population that they couldn't at the moment be enfranchised. You'd have to de-radicalize them first before you could give them citizenship.
Okay. So there's a little bit of complication here, because I'm looking at this, and I did a little bit of reading, so I take it with a grain of salt. But the party, I'm trying to think of the name now. I just want to make sure here. Let's see here. So you had the party, the Yesh Atid party, which is the leader of the centrist party, and you also had the party Yamina. So Yamina is led by this guy Naftali Bennett, who was in the IDF and everything else. Now he said is that Gaza is broken up into three, into A, B, C. I believe this goes back to like I think the Helsinki Accords. I could be wrong, in the 1970s. So when you say that, if they gave the land to Gaza, now things change when, governments take over, and when new governments take over, is that they would give 40% of that land because it originally belonged to Egypt. They say that they would give that land back to Egypt. Now, I doubt that would occur, but that is what Yamina, at least in their party program, has said, that they would give that land back to Egypt. So it's a very complicated thing, like I say. So there's a lot of complications, but at least that's what I read. Maybe I could be wrong, but yeah.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily be
if they gave the land back to Egypt.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily be opposed to that. I mean, it really depends. They gave the Sinai back to Egypt, and it didn't necessarily turn out to be that much of a problem. I think that Israel has, of course, a long track record of offering up territory in exchange for peace. I mean, it really goes to the two contrasting natures between the Jewish people in Israel that simply just want to be left alone and secure peace, but they'll do everything that they can to defend themselves. And yeah, if that means getting nuclear weapons, they'll do that too. And versus barbarians that would go after their civilian population and refuse to acknowledge their right to even exist.
Barbarians?
Would you not regard Hamas? Would you not? I'm specifically talking about Hamas here. Would you not regard? Would you not regard firing 4,000 rockets at civilians and killing 12 of them in 11 days? Would you not regard that as barbarism? Because if it weren't for the Iron Dome, hundreds of Israelis would have died from that. It's war, but
I
the
would
problem
say that
is
it's war. You also
Israel
had rockets that were launched from Lebanon as well.
Yeah, but there's a little bit of a difference between war, where you give the civilians an hour to get out and then you hit a military target like Israel does, versus war, where you're specifically trying to kill civilians like Hamas does. You know what Hamas's collateral damage is? That's when they accidentally hit a military target, because it doesn't have the same heart-wrenching factor to it. They're aiming to kill civilians. They're disappointed if it doesn't hit civilians. That is barbarism. How can we not characterize
we've talked about Hamas quite a bit.
Well, that's because they refuse to to acknowledge Israel's right to exist and continue to target Jews on the simple basis of their Jewishness. It's as simple as that.
Okay. Let's do this. When did Hamas start? When did they occur? I believe it's in the 1960s.
Like in the 90s.
I believe.
Like in its main form. I believe they came to power like in the 90s or some shit.
Yes.
Hamas. Let me just look up their background. Like, they're not that old.
Yeah, go ahead.
1987. 1987 they were founded.
Oh. Okay. So there was no. So, I mean, like I say, Hamas, I think, is used as a straw man a lot, because ultimately, I don't really think, like I say, it started in 1987. What the hell was happening between? What the hell was happening between 19?
Uncle Thomas, were those rockets strawmen? Like, if you had family members that were killed by them in Israel, were they just killed by? Oh, it was just straw, bro. It was just straw, just straw.
Well, I mean, you could say the same thing about the dead British, who were never administered either. So, I mean, like I say, there's no apology for that. So,
do Jews have a right to their own land that they've inhabited for thousands of years? Well, look, if you want to make here's the black pill, I guess, for you. If you want to make the it's just war argument, here's the black pill for you. Regardless of the outcome of our debate, you could honestly, like, straight up, 100%. In all earnestness, you could objectively kick my ass to the point where all my patrons don't support me anymore. I wind up shutting down the channel because it's so embarrassing to me. And my last video is saying, like, look, Uncle Thomas cucked me He won. He's right about everything. And that's that on this specific issue. And regardless of that, if that were to happen,
Right.
the fact of the matter remains that war is war.
Mhm.
Well, guess what? Israel has 400 nuclear weapons. And if you ever seriously try to come and take away Jewish sovereignty and you fuck around, Israel will nuke the shit out of you. Israel's not going anywhere ever. And so that's the reality. So regardless of what we talk about tonight, if we're going to do the war is war thing, they will fuck you up with nukes if you try to screw with them. And you can't do anything about it. So it's as simple as that.
And
Long
then
live
the
Israel.
UN,
Peace
and then the
free,
UN will put
peace
further
and
sanctions,
free.
I imagine.
Yeah, well,
And then, of course,
I
you
guess
have
that'll
the
make
fact that they
I
get
guess that'll make
supplies
you
from, they
feel
get
better
F-16 from the United
after you
States.
got nuked. I guess some sanctions are going to make you feel better after you got nuked. The point is that Israel will never be destroyed. Israel will do everything necessary to secure its existence. And regardless of my view, regardless of your
We
view,
must
that
secure the
will not
existence of
change.
the
And that
Jewish
is
race.
backed up by thermonuclear energy. And you fuck around, you will find out. They're dead serious. They would fucking use those nukes if the Arabs tried to truly bury them. They would do it. You're never getting rid of Israel. Anyway, we're
Arabs
coming
are
up on the
Hamas.
90.
Oh, hold
We're
on.
coming
The
up
Arabs
on
are Hamas.
we're coming up on the 90-minute mark. So this is the point where I want to go to closing remarks. So you can have a few minutes to make your final points, but we'll have to schedule another debate because otherwise this go on all night. So,
all right. See, the thing is that you let it kind of slip there at the end, where you didn't say Hamas, you didn't say Hezbollah, you said the Arabs.
Well, yeah,
so
I'm including Syria.
I guess it is Arabs that are true Untermensch.
No, but it's the Arab dictatorships. I'm including Jordan. I'm including Syria. Any of these powers can gang up with Palestine as they've done in the past. Now, Jordan has not been in that direction lately. However, the problem is there's a long track record of different states, as well as going beyond Arabs too. You look at Iran as being a number one threat recently in terms of their coordination with Hezbollah and Hamas and everything. The point is, these dictatorships, they are not above ganging up on Israel. And my point is, regardless of what the outcome of our debate is here tonight, if we're going to make the war is war argument, understand a true black pill here. No matter what, Israel will do anything in its power to stay alive, and that includes the use of nuclear weapons. So you're never getting rid of Israel. So my side objectively is winning in the material state of things right now, and all that your side could do is bitch on social media about it and go to protests and chant slogans, which is cute, but you're not going to change that reality.
Well, the thing is that they could do more than that, which is once this occurs, that you have people like Ilhan Omar. You can say what you will, but she goes back and forth. They could say, well, we need to stop. We need to stop giving parts for those F-15s. We need to stop doing that. We need to stop providing, these boots. We need to stop providing all those things.
Yeah, that's BDS. I'm against BDS. I've always regarded BDS as a seditious thing. So. Because you're undermining your ally.
So,
there's Ilhan Omar is a good example to bring up, by the way, because she specifically said on sanctions that sanctions were economic warfare. She actually used the term warfare to describe sanctions when it was with regard to Iran. Yet on Israel, she supports them. So she admits to wanting to wage war against America's top ally. Now, that to me is sedition. Now, legally, is it sedition? No, because she's not arguing to wage a war on the American government. But I would argue on a moral level, arguing for a war against your allies is tantamount to arguing for a war against your own government, because without your allies, you are nothing. And Israel is a key component to American and broader Western national security. And so in that regard, she is a fifth column and
Israel is a Jewish state.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely, and it's also an American, and it's also an American ally. It's like a key American ally in the world. Would you not doubt that? I hear your side refer to them as that they're with the Americans, right? So,
Well, Israel is also working with China as well. We talked about this in our other debate. They are getting support in terms of trains as well. Like I say, China. I'll put it this way: is China will play all the sides, same way as the United States does. China will make deals with Iran, and then we'll say, "Hey, Israel, would you like to buy some trains from us?" So this is the classic thing. China is going to, eventually take the place of the U.S. Israel does not give a shit about the U.S.
Well,
And
that's because
even
the
you
U.S. has
said
been.
this in our last debate, where it's like Israel is going to do what it's going to do, and
Yeah,
that's like I
but
say, this is absolute nonsense to say. Oh well,
that's because no, but that's because America's been a terrible ally recently. Obama and Biden have been god awful on Israel. If I was in charge of Israel, I wouldn't trust the Americans honestly to have my back. Like, and I've said before, I don't like Putin and I don't like Xi Jinping, but
when was it good?
I never blamed
Hold on.
Netanyahu. I never blamed Netanyahu for meeting with Putin and Xi Jinping and trying to get on good terms with them because he saw Obama throw him under a bus. And so his people's very existence is at stake. And so for him, if I was Netanyahu and I'm like, look, is there a 5% chance that the Americans don't have my back? Then I have to hedge my bets and have a backup plan, which is China. I don't blame him for that. The solution, be a better ally to Israel. Simple as that. So, and that goes for Canada.
When was the U.S.
a
better ally to Israel?
Before Obama.
When was the U.S. a better ally to Israel?
George W. Bush. George W. Bush was
name one president.
George W. Bush. I just did.
I mean, even you could even.
No, he is the president. I just did, bro.
The thing is that they didn't. Well, all right, yeah, you did. Yeah, I'll give you that. You know what I would say?
Even your own side would regard him as an ally, like an evil ally with Israel, right? So George Bush. So anyway, we got to wrap up this debate, otherwise we'll be here all night. So if you got your closing remarks,
okay, I'll finish. I'll finish up with this. The future of Israel is that Israel will become more of a Jewish state and less of a democracy. I'll even agree with you on this point. Yeah, Israel's not going anywhere. But Israel will start to embrace its actual Jewishness more. I was going to say this earlier, but I'll say it here, is that basically the Hasidic community and the Haredi community are growing in Israel. And I think that this will, like I say, who knows what this will occur in, but I do believe that Jewishness will override Zionism and override democracy. I think that, like I say, if I'm getting this correct, is that the idea of why you support Israel is because they are a democracy. It could have easily become more of a theocracy in some ways. And I do think that to a point, that is what's going to occur more and more. We see this even with Naftali Bennett, is that he has made deals with the Haredi community and with those types of parties. So I think that this is what's going to occur in the future. This idea that, Israel cares about democracy or whatever the case may be. No, if you want to say this is really what I should have started with, but you know what? It happens. Is it if Israel is a Jewish state, then it needs to practice Judaism. And you can say and holler all you want to that, religion should go away, this and that. Ultimately, Israel, if it is a Jewish state, it will become more supporting of that. And we've even seen with reformist Jews that they have started to take in the traditional roles of groups like the Haredi, this and that. And I think that this is what's going to occur more. And that is the real future. And that is how how Zionism is going to disappear, and you're going to have more of an inclusive culture. The thing is, and here's another point, and I'll finish it up after this, is groups like, as you say, Hamas started in 1987, Hezbollah started in 1982, partly due to the another invasion into Lebanon. The thing is that Israel, to a point, creates its own enemies. Is it where was the resistance that occurred from 1948 all the way through the 1980s? There were other groups. Yeah, there was Yasser Arafat, this and that. There was the PFLP as well. And there were, the bombers and everything else like that. But The thing is, it sounds like, to a point, Israel creates its own enemies. You know, if they had reached out better this and that, I'm sure people will say, and once again, it's interesting. I will read this one comment though from Microphone. Stalin was basio. Actually, Stalin supported the creation of Israel. He was part of the UN coalition who said, yeah, we should do that because he assumed that people like Abba Kovner, who was a Zionist but also was a Marxist, was going to, in their party, Mapam, which was the opposite of Mapai, which was more of a social democratic party that took over. And of course, David Ben-Gurion led that. But that's the truth, though, is, and largely the Soviet Union supported Israel up until the 1967 war. This is the same case with a lot of, communist countries. They supported Israel up until the 6-Day War. After that, then things changed. So I think that's all I have to say. Maybe that's just a continuation, but I'll leave it there. I think I'm done.
Yeah. So I would say basically, primarily is as far as Israel goes, what matters and what is at stake here in terms of the perception is the ethnicity component, that those agents that want to wipe out the Jews, they don't just want to wipe out religious Jews, they want to wipe out all Jews. And they want to establish total control over that area. And as I've noted on numerous occasions here, Israel has a right to exist. Long live Israel, based and free from the river to the sea. So thank you for watching, everybody, and have a good night.